The man who made America laugh and died alone, the untold story of William Frawley. When the final episode of one of the most beloved television programs in American history was being filmed, one of its most essential cast members was not on set. Not because of a scheduling conflict, not because of creative disagreement, because his body had finally given out, worn down by decades of hard living, and the particular kind of loneliness that accumulates in a man who spent his whole life making other people smile while his own personal world quietly fell apart. A few months after that final episode wrapped without him, he was gone. The man who had made tens of millions of Americans laugh every single week died in the way he had lived for most of his career. Just outside the warmth of the spotlight he had spent a lifetime earning. This is the story of William Frawley, and it is one of the most quietly devastating stories in the history of American entertainment. He was born in Burlington, Iowa in the winter of 1887, into an Irish Catholic household where duty came before desire and stability was the highest virtue anyone could aspire to. His father worked a steady job. His mother ran a household built on routine and faith. The arts existed in that world. Church music, community performances, local theater. But his decoration, not his direction. Nobody in Burlington in the late 19th century looked at a boy who liked to sing in the church choir and imagined a career. They imagined a steady profession, a reliable income, and a quiet life managed responsibly. Frawley followed that script for a while. He took a job as a stenographer for a railroad company, then moved to work as a court reporter. Fixed hours, reliable pay, a life that proceeded in an orderly fashion from one predictable day to the next. But in the evenings, he found himself drawn to small stages. Brief singing roles in modest musical productions. A few lines here. A short performance there. He would step into the light, do his part, and then slip back into the ordinary life that waited for him when the curtain came down. The stage felt different from everything else. It was uncertain and fluid and alive in a way that his daytime existence simply was not. His family hoped he would keep the stable profession. He kept returning to the stage. Each return made the regular world feel less like home. Each performance, however small, felt more like the life he was actually supposed to be living. He began writing short comedy scripts and selling them, discovering, in the process, that creativity could carry real monetary value. He formed a small performance partnership with his brother, which dissolved quickly, and set out alone. Moved to Denver, found small cafes where he could sing for changing audiences who did not stay long enough to become familiar. And there, in that transient musical world of early 20th century American entertainment, he met a pianist and began building a simple act. One voice. One piano. A few lines of patter threaded between familiar melodies. They took it on the road, and the road became his life. Vaudeville in those years was unlike any other performance environment that has existed before or since. The audience sat close enough that you could hear them breathe. Reactions were immediate and unfiltered. A line delivered with even slightly wrong timing could drop an entire room into silence. A perfectly landed joke could hold a crowd in the palm of your hand until the final bow. Frawley learned the craft in the only school that actually teaches it. In front of real people, night after night, in cities where nobody knew his name and nobody owed him anything. He learned to read a room before he spoke a word. He learned to hold a beat just long enough for laughter to arrive on its own terms. He learned to keep his voice measured and his presence grounded so that everything around him could breathe. These were not glamorous lessons. The pay barely covered the next day's expenses. Lodging shifted constantly. Cities blurred together. The life was essentially nomadic. A man with a suitcase, a set of costumes, and a working rhythm that demanded he be exactly right every night because there was no safety net if he wasn't. But in that demanding, unforgiving environment, something was being built that would define the rest of his career. An instinct for timing so precise it seemed like breathing. A comfort with uncertainty that most performers never fully develop. A way of standing in a scene. Grounded, unhurried, exactly where he needed to be. That made everything around him work better. He eventually found a performance partner who could work alongside him in the tight, physically demanding rhythm of the touring circuit. Their act moved through urban theaters and small town halls, adapting to whatever each room required while maintaining the essential structure that kept audiences engaged. Popular songs served as anchors. Spoken comedy provided the pulse. He learned to move from singing into dialogue without breaking the flow, to read an audience in the first 30 seconds and adjust everything accordingly. There was no single defining breakthrough, just a chain of performances, city by city, year by year, that gradually transformed the act of performing from something he tested to something he inhabited completely. The transition from vaudeville to legitimate theater came not as a dramatic leap, but as a natural evolution. The performance landscape was changing. And Frawley had spent enough years on the road to recognize the direction of the change before it fully arrived. Broadway represented a shift from immediate audience feedback to narrative continuity. From the flexible, improvisational energy of variety entertainment to the demands of sustaining a character through a structured story from beginning to end. He made that adjustment, a Broadway production in 1925, then others. Gradually, the skills he had built in the rough-and-tumble world of touring entertainment were recalibrated for a more rigorous form, one where every line served a larger arc rather than generating a standalone laugh. The culmination of that transition came in 1932 when he appeared in a major theatrical production carrying a fully formed dramatic character. Not a vaudeville performer doing an act, but an actor inhabiting a role with emotional continuity and interior logic. He had not abandoned his past. He had brought it with him and placed in service of something more demanding. The man who had learned to hold an audience through timing and restraint now used those same skills to sustain a human presence across the full length of a story. Film followed. Not immediately as a career-defining path, but gradually, as the entertainment industry reorganized itself around the new dominant medium. He signed with a major studio and appeared in more than 100 films across multiple genres over the following years. Never the lead, never the name above the title, but present reliably and repeatedly in the kind of supporting roles that keep a story functioning. The manager, the tough friend, the familiar face that signals to an audience exactly where they are in the narrative. He entered the frame, completed his function with precision, and exited so the story could continue. It was the same rhythm he had been practicing since Burlington, Iowa, just in front of a camera now instead of a crowd. By the late 1940s, Hollywood's appetite for what he offered was changing. New faces arrived constantly. The parts that had come steadily became sparse. The gaps between projects stretched. A man who had worked continuously for 3 decades found himself with mornings that opened with nowhere to be. He woke by habit, checked the time, stood at the window, waited for a cue that was not coming. The stillness of those empty days had a specific quality that only someone who has spent decades in continuous motion can really understand. Not rest, just absence. If this story is speaking to something in you, if the image of a talented man navigating decades of work and loneliness and the particular kind of pride that keeps a professional going when the world has moved on, please share this. Because what happens next is the chapter that most people actually remember. But the chapters before it are the ones that explain why it mattered so much. Television arrived and changed everything for the second time in William Frawley's professional life, though the entry point was not easy. When a landmark comedy series was being assembled in the early 1950s, there was genuine institutional resistance to casting him. His reputation preceded him. Stories about drinking, about difficult behavior, about the unpredictability that had quietly followed him through 2 decades of Hollywood work. The network was nervous. The production schedule was tight with no margin for the kind of instability his history suggested. The decision about whether to bring him in ultimately rested with the man who was producing the show, who looked past the reputation and trusted the professional. He believed the role of the gruff, lovable landlord required someone who had genuinely lived in the world that the character inhabited. Someone who carried the weight of experience in his face and his timing without having to pretend it was there. Frawley was offered the part with conditions clearly stated. Maintain the schedule. Be ready when the cameras rolled. Keep personal matters from becoming professional problems. He accepted. And when he stepped onto that set, the decades of vaudeville discipline took over. He had no interest in lengthy preparation or method acting exploration. He read the script, grasped the structure, memorized his lines quickly, and showed up knowing exactly what to do. His comedy operated on a slower internal rhythm than the show's more energetic lead performers. A lower register, more deliberate reactions, a restraint that created space for other people's lines to land while still keeping his own presence solid and recognizable. Fred Mertz was not the hero of the story. He was the anchor. And anchors, by definition, hold everything else in place. The show became one of the most watched programs in the history of American television. For years, it sat at the top of the ratings, and Fred Mertz became part of the weekly rhythm of millions of households. The familiar, slightly exasperated presence who could be counted on to be exactly who he was, episode after episode. Between 1953 and 1957, Frawley received 5 consecutive Emmy nominations for the role. Not a single win, but 5 nominations in the same show for the same character across 5 consecutive years says something that a single trophy never could. The industry recognized what audiences already knew, that his contribution was essential, even if it was not the kind of contribution that the award machinery was designed to honor. Off camera, his relationship with his co-star, the actress playing his wife in the show, was notably cool. Their professional backgrounds were different. their temperaments incompatible, their approaches to the work built on entirely different foundations. When the cameras were off, they maintained a polite distance. When the cameras rolled, Fred and Ethel were exactly what the story needed them to be. That is the mark of professional craft at the highest level. The ability to create genuine chemistry on screen, regardless of what exists off it. He never made the interpersonal difficulties a production problem. He arrived. He performed. He left. The show continued. There was a period when serious discussions were held about developing a separate program built around the secondary characters he shared the screen with. The audience affection was clearly there. The chemistry had been proven. But the project never materialized, and what remained were the episodes that aired. The body of work that would continue to reach new audiences for generations after everyone involved had passed on. His final major television role came on a family comedy where he played an older man living within a household that was not his own. A figure standing beside the center of the story, providing a kind of dry, practical continuity that kept the domestic environment from floating away from reality. The character was recognizably built on the same foundation as everything he had done before. Blunt. Economical. Slightly abrasive but oddly reassuring. He stayed with that show for several years, adapting to the changed production rhythms of early 1960s television, arriving on time, knowing his lines, completing his scenes, then going home to whatever version of home existed for him by then. His personal life had never found the stability his professional one eventually achieved. A marriage formed during the touring years, built not from romance but from the shared rhythm of two people performing together in constantly changing rooms, ended after years of the road had worn the connection down to nothing. There were no children to anchor the dissolution into something that had to be managed. Just two paths separating quietly after running alongside each other for too long in too many places that never felt like home. After that, he lived the way he had always lived. In proximity to work, in temporary spaces, alone at the end of each day. The drinking was not hidden. It was simply part of the landscape of his life. In vaudeville, it had been woven into the social fabric of the performance world. Post-show gatherings, the camaraderie of people living on the road with no fixed address. When the work slowed and the gaps between projects lengthened, the habit remained while the social context that had initially given it shape gradually disappeared. Those who worked closely with him noticed the variation. Some days he was precise and focused, exactly the professional his reputation for craft suggested. Other days the air around him felt different. Heavier, less predictable. In an industry that runs on schedules and reliability, unpredictability of any kind becomes a liability regardless of the talent it accompanies. People adjusted. Distance was maintained at exactly the distance required to keep the work moving. An altercation with another performer in the late 1920s, never fully resolved, never fully forgotten, had been circulating in the professional community for years before Hollywood became his primary landscape. It did not close doors directly. Nothing so dramatic occurred. It simply arrived in rooms before he did, adding a layer of calculation to the way people received him. An extra beat of hesitation. A slightly shorter conversation. Roles quietly reassigned without explanation. The accumulation of small signals that a person long experienced in the performance world knows exactly how to read, even when no one is willing to say anything directly. He survived it all by doing the only thing he had ever really known how to do. Keep showing up. Know where to stand. Deliver the line at the right moment. Step back when the scene is over. Do it again tomorrow. That rhythm, built in Iowa, and refined in vaudeville halls and tested in Hollywood studios, and finally validated in the living rooms of millions of American families, carried him across 8 decades of a life that was never as warm backstage as it appeared on screen. In 1960, his body finally reached a point that work could no longer override. The final episode of the show that had given him his greatest recognition was filmed without him. He was too ill to appear. A few months later, he was gone. He died in 1966 after a prolonged battle with heart disease, at nearly 80 years old, having worked in entertainment for more than 50 of those years. The man who had kept Fred Mertz alive in the hearts of America's living rooms passed away quietly. Not on a stage, not in front of a camera, not with an audience to hold him, but alone, in the way that the final chapter of a long solo journey tends to arrive. The people who had worked most closely with him spoke about the loss in terms that were warm and professionally respectful. Acknowledgments of a colleague who had contributed something real and lasting to work that had mattered. Audiences who received the news felt it as the closing of an era, a particular warmth in their weekly television lives that would not be replaced. What William Frawley's story ultimately tells us. When you follow it, from the railroad office in Omaha to the church choir, to the vaudeville halls, to the Broadway stages, to the Hollywood studios, to the television sets where Fred Mertz became a permanent fixture in American popular memory, is something about the specific dignity of the person who shows up and does the work year after year without ever being the name on the poster or the face on the marquee. There is a form of excellence that lives in that kind of consistent, unglamorous professional reliability. It does not generate the same stories as the spectacular rise and fall. It does not produce the mythology of sudden stardom, but it produces something the mythology cannot. A body of work that holds together, because someone was always there to hold it, standing in the right place at the right moment, keeping the rhythm steady so everything else could move. He made America laugh for decades and died in a quiet room without anyone waiting for him. That gap between what he gave to the world and what the world gave back is the part of his story that stays with you longest. He deserved more warmth than he received, but he gave more than most people ever could. And somewhere in that contradiction is the full, complicated, genuinely human truth of a remarkable life. If William Frawley's story moved you, if this portrait of a man who gave everything to his craft while navigating a private life that never quite offered the same warmth speaks to something real, please like this video and share it. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. The performers who stood beside the center of the story and kept it running deserve to be remembered as clearly as the ones whose names we never forgot.